October 19, 1856. Charles Spurgeon is 22 years old, standing in front of 12,000 people, and 7 of them are about to die while he is still preaching. He hadn't done anything wrong. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Fire!" There was no fire, but 12,000 people tried to leave through the same doors at the same time, and in the stampede, 7 people were crushed to death. Dozens more were injured. And Spurgeon, who was mid-sentence when it happened, who watched it unfold from the platform, who couldn't stop it and couldn't understand it, Spurgeon collapsed. Not metaphorically. He was 22 years old, already the most attended preacher in England, and in the days after Surrey Gardens, he went to pieces. He withdrew from London. He couldn't preach. He couldn't function. His friends described him as a man who had gone somewhere they couldn't reach him, and he wrote afterward that he had been, in his own words, pressed beyond measure and out of bounds with anguish, that his thoughts had become disordered, that he was even ready to die. He was 22, he had done nothing wrong. And the most promising preacher of his generation was sitting in a borrowed house in Brentwood, unable to get out of bed. Now here's what I want you to sit with before we go any further. The man who would spend the next 36 years preaching the sovereignty of God to millions. The man who would become the most widely read minister of the 19th century started that ministry in a nervous breakdown. He didn't choose, couldn't explain, and took weeks to emerge from. What he did with that collapse is what this video is about. There's a silence that lives in a lot of congregations. It's not malicious. It's not even intentional. It's just there. The silence around what happens when a believer suffers emotionally and doesn't know what to call it. Maybe you felt it. You've been sitting in the same pew for 40 years. You've taught Sunday school. You've served on committees. You've prayed with people through the worst years of their lives. And somewhere along the way, a weight settled on you that you can't lift. Not through prayer, not through reading, not through the things that used to work. And you haven't told anyone at church, because you already know what the room would do with it. At best, gentle concern. At worst, a kind of theological confusion. Maybe there's something you haven't surrendered. Maybe there's a sin you haven't addressed. Have you tried? And then the list begins. So you carry it quietly, because the alternative feels like admitting something you're not sure faith allows you to admit. What I want to show you today is that Charles Spurgeon, not as a biographical footnote, but as a working theologian writing for his students, had something precise to say about this. Not, it's okay to struggle. Precise. The kind of precise that gives you a distinction you can use. And the distinction starts with what happened after Surrey Gardens. Spurgeon did not turn the Surrey Gardens collapse into a testimony about how God brought him through. That's not what happened. What happened is that he recovered, slowly, imperfectly, and then spent the rest of his life paying attention to what the collapse had taught him about how human beings actually work. By 1875, he was running the Metropolitan Tabernacle Pastors College, training ministers. And he sat down to write a series of lectures that would eventually become a book, Lectures to My Students. One of those lectures was called The Minister's Fainting Fits. And what he wrote there is not what you'd expect from a Victorian preacher writing to young men entering ministry. He didn't write, "Cast your burdens on the Lord and press forward." He didn't write, "A man of faith should not be subject to such weakness." He wrote this, and this is a verified quote, taken directly from the text. Fits of depression come over the most of us. Usually cheerful as we may be, we must at intervals be cast down. The strong are not always vigorous, the wise not always ready, the brave not always courageous, and the joyous not always happy. Read that carefully. He is not offering comfort. He is making a taxonomic claim. The strong are not always vigorous, the wise are not always ready, the brave are not always courageous. He's saying, the category strong does not mean permanently capable of strength. The category believer does not mean permanently capable of joy. The capacity is real. The current failure of the capacity does not erase the category. That's a distinction. And it's not a gentle pastoral reassurance. It's a structural argument about how human beings are built. He went further. In the same lecture, he began to locate the source of these collapses, and the location he chose is important. He started with the body. He described what happens to a minister after intense effort, the physical depletion, the way the nervous system responds to sustained demand, The way a man can preach to thousands and then return to his study and find himself empty in a way that no amount of prayer immediately fills. He was describing, in the vocabulary available to him in the 1870s, what we would now recognize as the physiology of exhaustion and burnout. He said the preacher collapses for the same reason any machine collapses. It was used. That's the first half of the distinction. The collapse of the body, the depletion of the nervous system, the exhaustion after sustained effort, the way joy goes flat after loss or prolonged strain. This is not primarily a spiritual failure. It is a physical one. It happens to the strong. It happens to the vigorous. It happens to the man who has spent decades loving his congregation, raising his children, holding his family together, and showing up every Sunday even when showing up cost him something he didn't have to spare. The body breaks down. The mind breaks down. And Spurgeon, writing in 1875, said plainly, "This is not apostasy." But he didn't stop there, because the distinction he was drawing has a second half, and the second half is where it becomes useful rather than merely reassuring. Spurgeon was clear that not everything that looks like depression is the same thing. He distinguished between the collapse of the body and the collapse of the soul. A man whose nervous system has given out under the weight of years of service is not in the same place as a man who has genuinely turned from God, who has abandoned the faith, who has let go of the anchor. The symptoms can look similar from the outside. The experience from inside can feel similar, but they are not the same diagnosis. And treating them as the same thing, which the well-meaning congregation often does, causes real damage. When you tell a man whose body has broken down that his problem is spiritual, you've given him the wrong map. He'll search for the sin that caused it. He'll question the sufficiency of his prayer life. He'll feel a layer of guilt on top of the exhaustion. Guilt for failing spiritually at the very moment when what he actually needs is what God gave Elias. Spurgeon preached on Elias multiple times. He returned to that passage in 1 Kings chapter 19, the way a man returns to a place where something important happened to him. Elias had just won a spectacular victory. Fire from heaven the prophets of Baal defeated, and then Jezebel threatened him, and he ran into the wilderness, sat under a broom tree, and asked God to let him die. "It is enough," he said. "Lord, take away my life." And what did God do? He didn't send a sermon. He didn't send a rebuke. He didn't say, "Where is your faith, Elias? You just saw fire from heaven." He sent an angel. The angel touched Elias and said, "Rise and eat." And there was bread, baked on coals, and a jar of water. Elias ate. He slept. The angel came again. "Rise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." The journey is too great for you. Not, the journey is too great for a man of weak faith. Not, the journey is too great if you haven't surrendered fully. The journey is too great for you, Elias. The prophet, the man who had just called down fire. The journey is too great. Eat. Spurgeon saw in that passage a God who understood the difference between a man whose soul had failed and a man whose body had reached its limit. And he responded to the second with provision, not correction. Bread, water, sleep. And only after that, the still, small voice. The question, the commission. Spurgeon read that and saw a pattern he recognized from his own life. The depletions he had lived through were not signs that his soul had let go of God. They were signs that he was a human being who had been used and who needed, at intervals, the same thing Elias needed. Something concrete, something restorative, and the patience to wait for the voice that came after. There's a guide I put together for the person carrying two weights at once, the weight of their own unspoken suffering and the weight of praying for a child or grandchild who has walked away from the faith. It's called Praying for Prodigals, a 30-day guide from the Psalms and Spurgeon. 30 daily entries, each built on a specific psalm Spurgeon preached and a specific promise he named for the parent or grandparent who is tired of prayer advice that doesn't know what the room actually feels like. The link is in the description. Now, here is the part of Spurgeon's story that most people who tell it leave out. By 1888, Spurgeon was 54 years old. He had survived Surrey Gardens. He had survived the downgrade controversy, the fight with his own Baptist union that we'll return to in other videos, the battle that cost him friends he had trained and colleagues he had trusted. He was in physical decline, gout, kidney disease, the accumulated damage of decades of work and stress. And his emotional life was not peaceful. He continued to experience what he had always experienced. The intervals of darkness he described to his students, the depressions he said he hoped, "None of you ever get to such extremes of wretchedness as I go to." In that same year, he dictated a small daily devotional. He called it the checkbook of the Bank of Faith. 365 entries, each one a promise from Scripture, followed by a brief meditation. He wrote it in the middle of his own crisis, dictating on the days when he could barely hold a pen, assembling it across months when the downgrade was at its worst and his body was failing, and the church he loved was moving in a direction he couldn't stop. And what he wrote in it was not triumphant. It was not the theology of a man who had arrived somewhere safe. It was the theology of a man who needed every single day to return to the promises, because without returning to them daily, he wasn't sure he'd make it through the week. God is too good to be unkind, and he is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart. That line, which you may have seen attributed to him before, was not written from a place of resolution. It was written from inside the storm by a man who had not been granted the luxury of a tidy ending. He couldn't trace the hand. The downgrade was not reversing. His health was not improving. His friends had voted against him, and he was choosing every morning in the dark, sometimes dictating to a secretary because he couldn't manage the pen himself, to trust the heart he couldn't see. That is the inversion this video has been building toward. The man who taught sovereignty to millions was not using sovereignty as a doctrine for the platform. He was using it as a floor, not a promise that the suffering would end, not an explanation for why the suffering was happening. A floor, something that held even when everything else gave way, something that did not require him to feel it in order for it to be true. And here's what that means for the distinction he made in The Minister's Fainting Fits. When he told his students that depression comes over the most of us, that the strong are not always vigorous, the brave not always courageous, he wasn't offering them a comfort he had found from the outside. He was offering them a map he had drawn from inside the territory. He knew the difference between the collapse of the body and the collapse of the soul because he had lived inside that difference for decades. He had learned, through experience he would not have chosen, that you can be in the darkest week of your emotional life and still be held by something that doesn't depend on how the week feels. That is not a theology of triumphalism. It is a theology of endurance. And it is not the same thing. So here is the distinction, and I want you to carry it out of this video because it is the thing Spurgeon actually gave us. There is a collapse of the soul. It is real. It is serious. It is what happens when a person genuinely turns from the anchor, when the faith is not merely unfelt but relinquished. When someone is not suffering inside belief but has stepped outside it, that requires one kind of response. And there is a collapse of the body and the mind. Also real. Also serious. What happens when a human being, made of physical matter, subject to nervous systems and hormone levels, and the accumulated weight of decades of loving and losing and showing up, reaches the end of what the body can sustain without rest? When the joy goes flat, not because the faith is gone, but because the machine has been run past its limits. When the warmth disappears from the Sunday morning and the words feel hollow, and you sit in the same pew you've sat in for 40 years and you can't feel what used to be there. Spurgeon looked at that second person and he did not say, "Search for the hidden sin." He did not say, "You just need more faith." He said, "The strong are not always vigorous. The journey is too great for you. Rise and eat." He said, "You are not failing spiritually. You are failing physically, in a way that feels spiritual, in a context that has no vocabulary for the difference." And the first task is to get the diagnosis right, because the wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong remedy, and the wrong remedy can keep a person in silence for years. You have been in silence long enough. In January of 1892, Spurgeon died in Menton, France. He had gone there for his health, as he had done in other years. He never came back. He was 57 years old. He had preached to more people in person than any minister in recorded history to that point. He had written more books than most of his contemporaries would read in a lifetime. He had trained hundreds of ministers. He had built schools and orphanages and a publishing ministry that is still in print today, and he had never resolved the depressions. They came until near the end. He didn't overcome them in the way that the testimony circuit would prefer. What he did was something quieter and, I'd argue, harder. He kept going back to the floor, every morning, back to the promises. Not because the darkness had lifted, because the floor was still there even when the darkness hadn't. If you've been carrying something you can't name in the language your congregation gave you, if the warmth has gone flat and you don't know whether that means you're failing spiritually or simply failing physically, which is a different thing entirely, then what Spurgeon left behind is not a self-help framework. It's a map drawn by someone who was inside the same territory and came out not triumphant, but faithful, which, in the end, is the harder and more honest word. His word for what you may be living is not apostasy. It's not weakness of faith. It's not evidence that the decades were a mistake. His word for it is, the journey is too great for you. Rise and eat. The still, small voice comes after. Tell me what your congregation taught you, directly or indirectly, about what it means when a believer suffers emotionally. One sentence.